Sarah Martinez stepped out of her dusty Ford pickup truck, the Texas sun beating down on the cracked asphalt of Murphy's gun shop parking lot. She adjusted her simple baseball cap and smoothed down her faded jeans, nothing about her appearance suggesting the extraordinary skills that lay beneath her quiet exterior. The gun shop stood before her like a fortress of masculine culture, with its camouflage banners and hunting trophy displays visible through the large windows. She had driven 3 hours from her small ranch outside Austin to reach this particular shop, drawn by their advertisement for Barrett M82 rifles. After years of retirement from military service, Sarah had been considering adding one of these powerful weapons to her collection, not for any practical purpose, but for the memories it would evoke of her time serving her country in some of the world's most dangerous places. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and immediately she felt the weight of curious stares from the handful of customers browsing the aisles. The shop was exactly what she had expected, walls lined with rifles, shotguns, and handguns, glass cases filled with ammunition and accessories, and the distinct smell of gun oil and leather that seemed to permeate every serious firearms establishment. Behind the main counter stood 3 staff members, each fitting the stereotype of gun shop employees perfectly. There was Jake Morrison, the store manager, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a thick beard and arms covered in military-themed tattoos. Beside him stood Tommy Rodriguez, younger and leaner, wearing a tight black t-shirt that showed off his gym-built physique. The third employee, Marcus Webb, appeared to be in his 30s, sporting a buzz cut and the kind of cocky demeanor that suggested he thought he knew everything about firearms. Sarah approached the counter with the quiet confidence that had served her well throughout her military career. She had learned long ago that in male-dominated environments, the best strategy was often to speak softly and let her knowledge do the talking. However, she was also prepared for the inevitable skepticism that her gender would provoke in a place like this. "Good morning," she said politely, her voice carrying a slight southern drawl that hinted at her Texas roots. "I'm interested in looking at your Barrett rifles, specifically the M82 series." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Sarah caught the subtle smirks that passed between them. She had seen that look countless times before, the assumption that she was either shopping for her husband or boyfriend, or that she had no real understanding of what she was asking about. Jake stepped forward, his manner patronizing from the start. "Well now, ma'am, that's quite a powerful weapon you're asking about. The Barrett M82 isn't exactly what most folks would call beginner-friendly. It's a .50 caliber rifle that packs one hell of a punch. Are you sure that's what you're looking for?" Sarah maintained her composure, having anticipated this exact response. "I'm quite sure. I'd like to see what models you have available and discuss the specifications." Tommy laughed, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Lady, no offense, but do you have any idea what you're talking about? The Barrett M82 is a military-grade sniper rifle. It weighs about 30 pounds and has a recoil that would probably knock you flat on your back. Maybe you'd be more interested in something a little more manageable? We've got some nice .22 caliber rifles that might be more your speed." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah felt the familiar stirring of frustration that she had experienced so many times during her military service. She had proven herself repeatedly in combat situations, had earned the respect of her fellow soldiers through skill and dedication, yet here she was being treated like a naive amateur because of her gender. Marcus decided to join the conversation, leaning against the counter with a self-satisfied grin. "You know what? Tommy's right. The Barrett isn't a toy. It's designed for taking out vehicles, equipment, and, well, let's just say it's not for hunting deer. The muzzle blast alone would probably scare you half to death. Why don't you tell us what you're really looking for, and we can steer you towards something more appropriate." Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself that losing her temper would only reinforce their prejudices. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm specifically interested in the Barrett M82. I have experience with firearms and understand what I'm asking about. Could you please show me what you have in stock?" The 3 men looked at each other again, this time with barely concealed amusement. Jake shook his head slowly, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what experience with firearms means when we're talking about a weapon like this. Have you ever fired anything bigger than a hunting rifle? Because the Barrett M82 is in a completely different league. It's not just about the size, Tommy added, warming to the subject. It's about understanding ballistics, wind compensation, range estimation, technical stuff that takes years to master. This isn't something you can just pick up and use because you've shot a few targets at the local range. Marcus nodded sagely, as if imparting great wisdom. Plus, the cost factor. We're talking about a rifle that runs $15,000 to $20,000, not counting optics and accessories. That's a serious investment for something you probably won't be able to use effectively. Honestly, you'd be throwing your money away. Sarah felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she maintained her polite demeanor. She had dealt with far worse skepticism during her military career and had learned that sometimes the best response was simply persistence. I understand the cost and complexity. I'm still interested in seeing what you have available. Jake sighed dramatically, as if she were causing him great inconvenience. Look, lady, I'm trying to save you from making a big mistake here. The Barrett M82 isn't just expensive to buy, it's expensive to shoot. Each round costs about $5, and that's if you can even find the ammunition. Plus, you need a proper range that can handle that kind of power. Most civilian ranges won't even allow 50 caliber rifles. And, let's be honest, Tommy interjected with a smirk. Women just don't have the upper body strength to handle a rifle like that effectively. It's not sexist, it's just biology. The thing kicks like a mule, and you need serious muscle to control it properly. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had heard variations of this argument countless times throughout her career, from drill instructors who thought women didn't belong in combat roles to fellow soldiers who questioned whether she could carry her own weight in the field. Each time, she had let her performance speak for itself, proving doubters wrong through quiet competence rather than loud arguments. Marcus seemed to sense that he had struck a nerve and decided to push further. Plus, there's the whole intimidation factor. When you're handling a weapon with that much power, you need to project confidence and authority. No offense, but you just don't have that presence. The Barrett M82 is a weapon for serious operators, military, law enforcement, competitive shooters who've been training for years. Sarah looked at each of the three men in turn, noting the smugness in their expressions, the casual dismissal in their body language. She thought about her years of service, the missions she had completed, the lives she had saved through precision shooting in impossible conditions. She thought about the commendations in her closet at home, the letters of appreciation from commanding officers, the medals that meant more to her than these men could ever understand. But she also thought about something else, the importance of choosing her battles wisely. Getting into an argument with these men would accomplish nothing except confirming their preconceptions about emotional women who couldn't handle criticism. Instead, she decided to try a different approach. I understand your concerns, she said quietly, her voice steady and controlled. Perhaps you could show me what you have, and I can make my own decision about whether it's appropriate for my needs. Jake shook his head again, his expression now showing outright annoyance. Ma'am, I'm not going to waste my time pulling out expensive rifles so you can play with them for a few minutes before realizing their way out of your league. If you want to look at firearms, I can show you our selection of hunting rifles, target rifles, even some AR-15s if you want something with a little more kick. But the Barrett M82 is serious equipment for serious people. The dismissal was complete and final, delivered with the kind of condescending authority that Sarah had learned to recognize as a sign of deep insecurity. These men felt threatened by the possibility that she might actually know what she was talking about, so they were refusing to even give her the chance to prove it. Sarah stood at the counter for a moment, considering her options. She could insist more forcefully, potentially causing a scene that would accomplish nothing. She could walk away and find another dealer, which would be the practical choice, but would also mean letting these men's prejudices go unchallenged. Or she could wait and see if an opportunity presented itself to demonstrate that their assumptions were wrong. As she pondered her next move, she became aware of another customer who had been browsing the store during her conversation with the staff. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military experience. He had been examining some handguns in a nearby display case, but she noticed that his attention seemed to be divided between the weapons and the conversation taking place at the counter. The man approached slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. He wore simple civilian clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt. But something about his posture and the way he carried himself suggested a lifetime of military discipline. His eyes, Sarah noticed, had the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "Excuse me," he said politely, addressing the staff behind the counter. His voice carried a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the Barrett M82. I'm actually in the market for one myself, and I'd be very interested in seeing what you have available." Jake's demeanor changed instantly, his dismissive attitude replaced by eager professionalism. "Absolutely, sir. We have several models in stock, including some beautiful examples of the M82A1. Are you looking for something specific? Military background, by any chance?" The older man smiled slightly. "You could say that. I spent some time in the service, yes, mainly in roles that required precision shooting. I've been retired for a few years now, but I'm interested in adding a Barrett to my personal collection." Tommy and Marcus both perked up immediately, clearly impressed by the customer's credentials. "That's fantastic, sir," Tommy said enthusiastically. "It's always great to meet a fellow veteran. What branch did you serve in?" "Army," the man replied simply. "Special operations, mostly. Spent a lot of time in places where long-range precision was a necessity rather than a hobby." Sarah watched this exchange with interest, noting how completely the staff's attitude had changed. The same weapon they had dismissed as inappropriate for her was now being discussed with reverence and enthusiasm simply because a man with military credentials was asking about it. Jake was already moving toward a locked cabinet behind the counter. "Let me show you what we've got. This here is a beautiful M82A1, barely used. Comes with a Leupold scope that's been professionally mounted and zeroed. The previous owner was a competitive shooter who kept it in perfect condition." As Jake carefully lifted the massive rifle from its case, Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly. The Barrett M82A1 was indeed an impressive weapon, over 4 feet long, weighing nearly 30 pounds, and capable of sending a .50 caliber round accurately over distances that most people couldn't even see clearly. It was a tool she knew intimately, having relied on similar rifles during some of the most challenging missions of her military career. The older gentleman examined the rifle with the practiced eye of someone who truly understood its capabilities. He checked the action, examined the barrel, and tested the scope mounting system with the kind of thorough inspection that spoke of real expertise. "Beautiful piece," he commented, handling the weapon with obvious familiarity. "The M82A1 has always been my preferred variant. Better recoil mitigation than the original M82, and the improvements to the muzzle brake make a significant difference in follow-up shot capability." Sarah found herself nodding slightly in agreement, recognizing the accuracy of his technical assessment. The improvements he mentioned were exactly the kind of details that only someone with real operational experience would know and appreciate. Marcus, eager to demonstrate his own knowledge, jumped into the conversation. "Absolutely right, sir. The recoil mitigation system is a huge improvement. Of course, it still takes considerable skill and strength to use effectively. This isn't the kind of weapon that just anyone can pick up and master." The older man glanced briefly at Sarah, and she caught something in his expression, a flicker of interest, perhaps, or recognition of the irony in Marcus's comment. "You're absolutely right," he agreed mildly. "Effective use of a weapon like this requires extensive training and experience. Not everyone has what it takes to be a precision shooter." Jake beamed with pride at having such a knowledgeable customer. "Exactly. That's what I was just explaining to this lady here. She came in asking about Barrett rifles, but I don't think she really understands what she'd be getting into. The Barrett M82 isn't for everyone." Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and frustration, but she maintained her composure. The older gentleman looked at her again, this time with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive assessment she was used to receiving. "Is that so?" he said quietly, his tone neutral, but somehow carrying an undertone that made the staff members shift uncomfortably. "And what led you to conclude that she wasn't qualified to handle such a weapon?" Tommy jumped in eagerly, apparently not recognizing the subtle challenge in the question. Well, sir, it's pretty obvious. No offense to the lady, but women just don't have the physical capabilities for this kind of shooting. Plus, she doesn't have any military background that we know of. The Barrett M82 requires serious training and experience. I see, the older man said, his voice still carefully neutral. And you determined her lack of qualifications how, exactly? Marcus laughed, seemingly oblivious to the direction the conversation was taking. Just look at her, sir. She's obviously not military. Probably never fired anything bigger than a hunting rifle in her life. We're just trying to steer her towards something more appropriate for her skill level. The older gentleman set the Barrett rifle carefully back in its case and turned to face Sarah directly. When their eyes met, she saw something there that made her straighten slightly, a recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated because of assumptions rather than evidence. Ma'am, he said politely, I apologize for intruding on your conversation, but I'm curious. Do you have experience with precision shooting? These gentlemen seem quite certain about your qualifications, but I'd prefer to hear from you directly. The gun shop fell silent, and Sarah realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, not a chance to argue or defend herself, but an opportunity to simply state the truth and let it speak for itself. Yes, she said quietly, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. I do have experience with precision shooting. Quite a bit, actually. The three staff members exchanged glances, their expressions showing a mixture of skepticism and amusement. Jake was the first to speak, his tone patronizing and dismissive. Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion here about what precision shooting means in a military context. Shooting clay pigeons, or even hunting deer, isn't quite the same as the kind of long-range engagement that the Barrett M82 was designed for. Sarah looked at him calmly, feeling the familiar weight of having to prove herself yet again. But this time, something was different. The presence of the older gentleman, his obvious expertise, and his willingness to listen rather than assume, gave her a sense that perhaps this conversation might finally lead somewhere productive. Sarah took a measured breath, looking directly at the older gentleman who had asked the question. Something in his demeanor suggested he would actually listen to her answer, unlike the three staff members who had already made up their minds about her capabilities. I served 8 years as a designated marksman with the Army, she said simply, her voice steady and clear. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq. I was trained on multiple weapons systems, including the Barrett M82A1, the M24 SWS, and the M110 SAS. My longest confirmed kill was at 1,847 meters using an M82A1 with match-grade ammunition. The silence that followed her statement was profound. Tommy's mouth actually fell open, while Marcus stopped mid-gesture, his hand frozen halfway to his beard. Jake's eyes widened, and, for the first time since Sarah had entered the store, none of the 3 men seemed to have a ready response. The older gentleman nodded slowly, his expression showing what appeared to be professional respect. Designated marksman, he repeated thoughtfully. That's serious training. 8 years of service suggest you saw considerable action during the height of operations in both theaters. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, maintaining the respectful tone she had used when addressing superior officers. I was attached to various units that required precision fire support, primarily counter-sniper operations and long-range reconnaissance. Tommy finally found his voice, though it came out as a somewhat strangled whisper. You're saying you're actually military? Like, real military? Sarah turned to look at him, noting how his earlier cockiness had evaporated completely. I am military. Or rather, I was. I completed my service 3 years ago and returned to civilian life. Marcus shook his head, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with his preconceptions. But you don't look like. I mean, you seem so normal, Sarah suggested with a slight smile. Most veterans do, once we take off the uniform. We're just regular people who happen to serve our country. The older gentleman stepped closer to the counter, his interest clearly piqued. If you don't mind me asking, what units were you with? I spent considerable time coordinating with various Army elements during my own service. I was primarily with the 10th Mountain Division during my first 2 deployments, Sarah replied. later transferred to work with some special operations units that required additional precision capabilities. Most of that work is still classified, so I can't go into specific details. Jake cleared his throat nervously, apparently realizing that his earlier dismissive attitude might have been a serious mistake. Ma'am, we had no idea about your background. You should have mentioned your military service right from the start. Sarah turned to look at him, her expression calm, but carrying an undertone of steel. Why should I have to prove my qualifications before you're willing to treat me with basic respect? You didn't ask the gentleman here for his military credentials before showing him the rifle. The truth of her statement hung in the air like an accusation, and all three staff members shifted uncomfortably. The older gentleman watched this exchange with obvious interest, his eyes moving between Sarah and the gun shop employees as if he were evaluating their responses. Tommy tried to salvage the situation with a weak smile. Look, we get a lot of people coming in here who think they know about firearms, but really don't. We were just being cautious, trying to make sure you didn't get in over your head with something dangerous. By assuming I was incompetent based on my gender? Sarah asked quietly. Would you have been equally cautious if a man had walked in asking about the same rifle? Marcus bristled slightly at the implication. That's not fair. We weren't being sexist. We were being professional. There are real safety concerns with weapons like the Barrett M82. The older gentleman spoke up before Sarah could respond, his voice carrying a tone of mild curiosity. I'm interested in your perspective on safety concerns, son. What specific safety issues do you think a designated marksman with 8 years of military service might not be aware of? The question was delivered in such a reasonable tone that Marcus didn't immediately recognize the trap he was walking into. Well, the recoil management, the proper shooting position, understanding the ballistics. Which ballistics specifically? The older man pressed gently. The trajectory drop at various ranges? Wind compensation? Temperature effects on muzzle velocity? Humidity impacts on bullet flight? Marcus hesitated, clearly realizing he was being tested, but not sure how to respond. All of that, I guess. It's complex stuff that takes years to master. Sarah decided to step in, her voice taking on the tone she had used when instructing new soldiers. The Barrett M82A1 fires a .50 BMG round at approximately 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, you're looking at roughly 127 inches of drop with standard ball ammunition, assuming sea-level conditions and no wind. The 750 grain match rounds I preferred had slightly different characteristics, less drop, but more sensitive to crosswinds. She paused, noting the stunned expressions on the faces of the gun shop staff. Wind compensation depends on wind speed and angle, obviously. A 10 miles per hour crosswind at 1,000 yards requires approximately 44 inches of windage adjustment. Temperature affects powder burn rate, and thus muzzle velocity. You can expect about 1 foot per second change in velocity per degree Fahrenheit of temperature variation. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the shop's air conditioning system. Jake, Tommy, and Marcus stared at Sarah as if she had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language, which in a sense she had. The technical knowledge she had just displayed was not something that could be learned from magazines or internet forums. It came from years of practical application under life and death conditions. The older gentleman smiled for the first time since entering the store. That's remarkably precise information. Most people who claim to know about long-range shooting can't quote ballistics data with that level of accuracy. Sarah shrugged modestly. When your life and the lives of your team members depend on making shots at extreme range, you tend to memorize the details pretty thoroughly. Tommy attempted to regain some ground, his voice uncertain. Okay, so maybe you do know the technical stuff. But knowing numbers and actually being able to perform under pressure are two different things. Sarah looked at him calmly. You're absolutely right. Theory and practice are very different things. Would you like me to describe some of the conditions under which I've had to make precision shots? Or perhaps you'd prefer to hear about the time I had to take out 3 enemy snipers in succession while under mortar fire. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and Tommy quickly backed down. No, that's okay. I believe you. Marcus, however, seemed determined to maintain some level of skepticism. Look, I'm not questioning your military service. That's obviously legitimate. But Military shooting and civilian shooting are different things. The equipment is different, the conditions are different. You're correct, Sarah agreed. Military shooting is generally much more difficult. Civilian precision shooting typically involves known distances, prepared positions, optimal weather conditions, and no one shooting back at you. It's considerably less challenging than combat operations. The older gentleman chuckled softly at this response, clearly appreciating the subtle way Sarah had demolished Marcus's argument. She has a point there, son. I've done both military and civilian precision shooting, and I can assure you that if someone can perform effectively in combat, they'll have no trouble adapting to civilian conditions. Jake, sensing that the conversation was spiraling away from his control, decided to try a different approach. Ma'am, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. We clearly underestimated your qualifications. Let me show you our selection of Barrett rifles, and we can discuss what might work best for your needs. Sarah studied his face for a moment, seeing the forced smile and the underlying resentment at having been proven wrong so decisively. I appreciate the apology, but I'm curious, has your assessment of my qualifications actually changed, or are you just responding to social pressure now that my credentials have been established? The question caught Jake off guard, and his forced smile faltered. What do you mean? I mean that nothing about me has changed in the last 10 minutes except your knowledge of my background. I'm the same person who walked in here asking about Barrett rifles. If I was unqualified 30 minutes ago, what specifically has changed to make me qualified now? The older gentleman nodded approvingly at her question. That's an excellent point. Either she was qualified when she first asked, or she's not qualified now. Her credentials haven't changed, only your awareness of them. Tommy fidgeted uncomfortably. Look, we made some assumptions, okay? Maybe they were wrong assumptions. But we deal with a lot of people who think they know more than they do about firearms. We were just being careful. Careful about what? Sarah pressed. Were you concerned I might hurt myself with the rifle? Were you worried I might damage your merchandise? Or were you simply uncomfortable with the idea of a woman wanting to purchase a weapon that doesn't fit your preconceptions about appropriate feminine interests? Marcus's face reddened slightly. We weren't. Look, this isn't about gender. This is about experience and capability. Then, let's talk about experience and capability, Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the obvious tension in the room. I have 8 years of military service with extensive training on precision weapon systems. I have combat experience using the exact rifle I'm interested in purchasing. I have demonstrated knowledge of ballistics and weapon characteristics that exceeds what most civilian shooters ever acquire. By what objective measure am I unqualified to purchase this rifle? The 3 staff members exchanged glances, clearly struggling to find a response that didn't acknowledge the obvious prejudice that had driven their initial reaction. The older gentleman watched this interplay with what appeared to be growing amusement, though he maintained his polite, professional demeanor. Finally, Jake attempted to regain control of the situation by returning to business. You're absolutely right, ma'am. Let me show you what we have available. He moved toward the rifle case with obvious reluctance, his body language suggesting he was going through the motions rather than acting out of genuine enthusiasm. As Jake began removing rifles from the locked cabinet, the older gentleman approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. If you don't mind me asking, what's your interest in acquiring a Barrett rifle for civilian use? Most veterans I know who purchase precision rifles are either competitive shooters or collectors. Sarah appreciated the genuine curiosity in his question, such a contrast to the assumptions she had been dealing with from the staff. A bit of both, actually. I enjoyed the precision shooting aspect of my military service, and I've been considering getting back into competitive long-range shooting. Plus, there's a certain sentimental value to working with familiar equipment. Competitive shooting is an excellent way to maintain skills, the older man agreed. There are some outstanding long-range matches in Texas. The precision rifle community is quite welcoming to veterans, regardless of their background. Jake had arranged 3 Barrett rifles on the counter, 2 M82A1 models, and 1 M107A1. Despite his obvious discomfort with the situation, he began his sales presentation with professional competence. These are our current Barrett inventory. The first M82A1 is what I showed the gentleman earlier, barely used, excellent condition, includes the Leupold scope. The second M82A1 is older, but has been completely refurbished. The M107A1 is newer with some improved features, but it's also considerably more expensive. Sarah approached the rifles with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was examining. She checked the actions, examined the barrels for wear, and tested the scope mounting systems with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these inspections countless times under field conditions. The first M82A1 appears to be in excellent condition, she observed, running her hands along the rifle with obvious familiarity. The barrel shows minimal wear, and the scope mounting system is properly torqued. This would be suitable for precision work. Tommy watched her examination with obvious surprise. You really do know what you're looking for, don't you? Sarah glanced at him briefly. Yes, I do. Just as I did when I first walked in here an hour ago. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Tommy had the grace to look embarrassed. The older gentleman continued to observe the interaction with interest, occasionally nodding when Sarah made particularly astute technical observations about the rifles. As Sarah continued her examination, she became aware that the atmosphere in the store had shifted dramatically. Where there had been condescension and dismissal, there was now a grudging respect, though it was clearly mixed with resentment from the staff members who had been so thoroughly proven wrong. The transformation was educational, but also somewhat depressing. These men were willing to respect her expertise now that they knew her credentials, but they had been completely unwilling to even consider that she might possess such expertise based on her actual knowledge and behavior. The prejudice had been so strong that it had overridden all evidence to the contrary. Marcus, still struggling to process what had happened, made one final attempt to assert some authority. So, assuming you decide to purchase one of these rifles, do you have a place to shoot it? Like I mentioned earlier, most civilian ranges don't allow .50 caliber weapons. Sarah looked up from the rifle she was examining. I have access to a private range outside Austin that accommodates long-range precision shooting. The property belongs to another veteran who specializes in competitive shooting. We have targets set up out to 2,000 meters. 2,000 meters? Tommy repeated, clearly impressed despite himself. That's over a mile. Yes, it is, Sarah confirmed. Those shots at that distance are more about testing equipment limitations than practical application. Most useful precision work happens at considerably shorter ranges. The older gentleman stepped closer to the counter. That sounds like an excellent facility. I'd be interested in learning more about competitive opportunities in the area, if you don't mind sharing information. Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had shown since entering the store. I'd be happy to put you in touch with the range owner. He's always looking for serious precision shooters to join our informal competitions. As they continued to discuss technical details about the rifles and shooting opportunities, the three gun shop employees gradually faded into the background of the conversation. It became increasingly clear that they were out of their depth when the discussion moved beyond basic sales presentations to the kind of detailed technical knowledge that came from real operational experience. Jake made several attempts to regain control of the interaction, offering additional accessories and ammunition options, but his suggestions were clearly based on marketing materials rather than practical experience. Both Sarah and the older gentleman politely acknowledged his contributions while continuing their more substantive discussion about ballistics, equipment modifications, and shooting techniques. The disparity in knowledge levels became increasingly obvious as the conversation progressed. Where Jake, Tommy, and Marcus relied on manufacturer specifications and general information they had absorbed from firearms magazines, Sarah and the older gentleman discussed nuanced details about weapon performance under various conditions, ammunition characteristics, and the practical considerations involved in precision shooting. It was during this technical discussion that Sarah began to notice something unusual about her fellow customer. His knowledge of precision shooting was clearly extensive, but there were certain details in his comments that suggested experience beyond even what she might expect from a retired military marksman. He spoke about ballistics and equipment with the kind of deep understanding that came from not just using weapons, but from being involved in their development and refinement. When he mentioned specific technical modifications to the Barrett M82 system that had been implemented during certain operational periods, Sarah realized that his military background was likely far more significant than he had initially indicated. The details he referenced were not widely known, even within the precision shooting community. As their conversation continued, she found herself studying him more carefully, trying to place the combination of knowledge, bearing, and subtle authority that he projected. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't immediately identify what it was. The realization, when it came, hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's hands stilled on the Barrett rifle as the pieces suddenly clicked into place. The authoritative bearing, the extensive technical knowledge, the specific details about operational modifications. She had seen this man before, though not in civilian clothes and not in a gun shop in rural Texas. General William Hayes. 3 stars. Former commander of Joint Special Operations Command. The recognition hit her so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. This was the man who had personally presented her with the Army Commendation Medal for her actions during Operation Red Sand, when she had provided precision fire support that saved an entire patrol from an enemy ambush. She had stood at attention in a military briefing room 2 years ago while this same man read her citation and pinned the medal to her dress uniform. But here, in civilian clothes, with silver hair, and without the imposing presence of full military regalia, he looked like any other retired veteran browsing for firearms. The transformation was so complete that she might never have recognized him if not for his detailed knowledge of specialized military equipment and procedures. Sarah struggled to maintain her composure as memories flooded back. General Hayes had been legendary within special operations circles, a soldier's soldier who had risen through the ranks based on competence and leadership rather than politics. His reputation for recognizing and rewarding merit regardless of background or demographics was well known throughout the Army. During the medal presentation, he had taken the unusual step of speaking with her privately afterward, asking detailed questions about the engagement and her tactical decisions. It had been clear that he understood precision shooting at a level that went beyond most senior officers, and his questions had demonstrated a genuine appreciation for the technical challenges she had faced. Now, watching him examine the Barrett rifle with obvious expertise, while the gun shop employees continued to hover nervously in the background, Sarah realized that she was witnessing something remarkable. One of the most senior military leaders in recent Army history was being treated with respectful attention by the same men who had dismissed her as unqualified, not because they recognized him, but simply because he was male and carried himself with obvious authority. The irony was not lost on her. These men were showing automatic deference to General Hayes while having spent an hour trying to convince her that she was unqualified to handle the same equipment she had used in combat under his ultimate command. General Hayes continued his examination of the rifle, seemingly unaware of her recognition. He was asking Jake detailed questions about the weapon's maintenance history and ammunition preferences, questions that Jake was struggling to answer with any real authority. Has this particular rifle been used for precision work, or primarily for recreational shooting? The general asked, running his finger along the barrel with practiced familiarity. Jake stammered slightly, clearly out of his depth. Well, the previous owner said he used it for long-range target shooting. I'm not sure about the specific distances or conditions. Sarah watched as General Hayes nodded politely, though she could see from his expression that Jake's vague response was not particularly helpful. She found herself in an unusual position. She wanted to contribute to the conversation, but revealing her recognition of the general in front of the gun shop staff would create complications for everyone involved. General Hayes seemed to sense her internal struggle. He glanced in her direction with what appeared to be casual curiosity, but she caught something in his expression that suggested he was equally trying to place where he might have seen her before. You mentioned earlier that you had experience with the M82A1 in operational environments, he said to her, his tone conversational, but carrying an undertone that suggested professional interest. I'd be curious to hear your assessment of its performance characteristics under field conditions. Sarah realized that this was both a test and an opportunity. General Hayes was giving her a chance to demonstrate her expertise while he tried to determine where he might know her from. She chose her words carefully, providing detailed information while avoiding any specifics that might compromise operational security. The M-82A1 performed exceptionally well in desert environments, she replied, her voice steady despite her internal nervousness. The main challenges were dealing with extreme temperature variations and the effects of mirage on long-range target acquisition. The weapon itself was remarkably reliable, even after extended periods without maintenance opportunities. General Hayes nodded approvingly. Temperature management is certainly a significant factor in desert operations. Did you find the standard optics adequate for the conditions you encountered? Sarah smiled slightly, appreciating the technical nature of his question. The standard day optics were excellent for most applications. We occasionally had access to enhanced systems for specific operations, which provided additional capabilities in challenging light conditions. She was being deliberately vague about the classified equipment she had used, but General Hayes clearly understood the implications of her comments. His questions became more specific, focusing on technical details that only someone with real operational experience would understand. Tommy and Marcus listened to this exchange with obvious confusion, while Jake continued to fidget nervously behind the counter. It was clear that the conversation had moved far beyond their level of expertise, and they were struggling to find ways to contribute meaningfully. "Ma'am," Marcus finally interjected, "you keep mentioning desert operations. Were you deployed in Afghanistan or Iraq?" Sarah glanced at him before responding. "Both theaters, multiple deployments. Most of my precision shooting work was in support of various units conducting specialized operations." General Hayes's eyes sharpened at her response, and she could see him working through the implications of what she had said. The combination of multiple deployments, precision shooting work, and specialized operations significantly narrowed the field of possible positions she might have held. "Specialized operations can be quite demanding," he observed mildly. "The precision requirements are typically much more stringent than conventional operations." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, automatically reverting to the formal address she had used during their previous meeting. The margin for error in those situations is essentially zero. Equipment reliability and shooter competence are absolutely critical. The "sir" seemed to trigger something in General Hayes's memory. He studied her face more intently, his expression thoughtful. Sarah could practically see him working through mental files, trying to match her face with specific occasions when he might have encountered her. Jake, sensing that he was losing control of the interaction entirely, attempted to redirect the conversation back to business. "So, ma'am, are you interested in purchasing one of these rifles? We can discuss pricing and financing options if you'd like." Sarah looked down at the Barrett M-82A1 she had been examining. It was indeed an excellent example of the weapon, well-maintained and properly equipped. Under normal circumstances, she would have been ready to complete the purchase. However, the presence of General Hayes had completely changed the dynamic of the situation. She found herself wondering whether she should reveal her recognition of him, and, if so, how to do it without creating an awkward situation for everyone involved. General Hayes seemed to be wrestling with a similar dilemma. He continued to study her face with growing recognition, but he was clearly trying to place the context of their previous meeting. The formal way she had addressed him as "sir" had obviously been a significant clue. The moment of recognition, when it came, was almost visible on General Hayes's face. His eyes widened slightly, and Sarah saw the exact instant when he remembered her, not just as another veteran interested in purchasing firearms, but as Sergeant First Class Sarah Martinez, the precision marksman who had received a commendation for exceptional service under his command. "Sergeant Martinez," he said quietly, the title coming out automatically despite the civilian setting. The three gun shop employees looked confused by the sudden formality, but Sarah straightened instinctively at being addressed by her former rank and name. "Yes, sir," she replied, the military protocol taking precedence over civilian conventions. General Hayes extended his hand, and Sarah shook it with the firm grip that had been drilled into her during basic training. "It's good to see you again, Sergeant. I trust civilian life has been treating you well." "Yes, sir, it has," Sarah replied, though her voice carried a hint of the frustration she had experienced over the past hour. "Though I found that some aspects of civilian life require different adjustments than I had anticipated." General Hayes glanced meaningfully at the three staff members, who were watching this exchange with obvious bewilderment. I can imagine that the transition presents certain challenges, particularly when people make assumptions based on appearances rather than capabilities. The comment was delivered in such a mild tone that Jake, Tommy, and Marcus didn't immediately grasp its implications. But Sarah caught the steel underneath the polite words, and she realized that General Hayes had been observing the entire interaction from the moment he entered the store. "You know each other?" Tommy asked, clearly struggling to understand how a retired military officer and a female customer could have any connection. General Hayes smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sergeant Martinez, and I have had professional interactions in the past. She's one of the finest precision marksmen I've had the privilege to work with during my military career." The simple statement hit the gun shop like a bombshell. Jake's mouth fell open, while Marcus and Tommy stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. The casual dismissal they had shown her suddenly took on a much more serious significance. "Professional interactions?" Jake repeated weakly. "Indeed," General Hayes confirmed, his voice taking on the tone of command authority that had made him legendary within military circles. "Sergeant Martinez provided precision fire support for multiple special operations throughout her deployments. Her technical expertise and performance under pressure were exemplary." Sarah felt a mix of vindication and embarrassment as the full weight of General Hayes's endorsement settled over the gun shop. While it was gratifying to have her credentials confirmed by such an authoritative source, it was also frustrating that it required the intervention of a 3-star general to get these men to take her seriously. Tommy was the first to attempt damage control. "Sir, we had no idea about her background." "She didn't mention." "She shouldn't have had to mention it," General Hayes interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made seasoned soldiers snap to attention. "Her knowledge and bearing should have been sufficient indication of her competence. Instead, you chose to make assumptions based on her gender rather than her demonstrated expertise." The rebuke was delivered without raising his voice, but it carried the weight of absolute command authority. All 3 staff members shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they were being criticized by someone whose opinion carried significant weight. Marcus attempted a weak defense. "We were just being cautious about safety." "Safety?" General Hayes repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. "You were concerned about the safety of a precision marksman who has successfully completed multiple combat deployments using this exact weapon system? That's an interesting interpretation of caution." Sarah watched this exchange with fascination. She had seen General Hayes in action during military briefings, where his ability to dissect poor reasoning and questionable decisions was legendary. Watching him apply those same skills to the gun shop employees was both educational and deeply satisfying. Jake made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Sir, we apologize for any misunderstanding. We're always happy to work with qualified customers, regardless of their background." General Hayes studied Jake for a long moment before responding. "The qualification of your customers should be determined by their knowledge and experience, not by whether they fit your preconceptions about who belongs in your store." Sergeant Martinez demonstrated extensive technical knowledge from the moment she began speaking with you. The fact that you dismissed that knowledge because of her gender reflects poorly on your professional judgment. The criticism was precise and devastating, delivered with the kind of clinical objectivity that made it impossible to dismiss or argue against. Sarah found herself appreciating not just the defense of her qualifications, but the educational value of watching a master tactician dismantle flawed reasoning. The atmosphere in the gun shop had completely transformed. Where there had been casual dismissal and condescension, there was now nervous deference and barely concealed panic. The 3 staff members clearly understood that they had made a serious mistake, but they were struggling to find a way to recover from it. General Hayes turned back to Sarah, his manner shifting from command authority to collegial respect. "Sergeant, I believe you were interested in purchasing one of these rifles. Have you had a chance to complete your evaluation?" Sarah looked down at the Barrett M82A1 she had been examining, then back at the 3 staff members who were watching nervously. The weapon was exactly what she wanted, and, under normal circumstances, she would have been ready to complete the purchase. However, the events of the past hour had left her questioning whether she wanted to do business with people who had treated her with such obvious disrespect. The fact that they were now being deferential only because of General Hayes's intervention made their earlier behavior seem even more problematic. "I'm still considering my options," she replied diplomatically. General Hayes understood the subtext of Sarah's diplomatic response immediately. He had spent decades reading between the lines of military communications and civilian interactions, and it was clear to him that Sarah's interest in purchasing from this particular establishment had been significantly dampened by the treatment she had received. "Perhaps," the general said thoughtfully, "we might continue our discussion about precision shooting opportunities in the area outside. I'd be interested in learning more about the competitive scene you mentioned earlier." Sarah nodded gratefully, recognizing the graceful exit he was offering. "That sounds excellent, sir. I'd be happy to share information about local ranges and competitions." Jake panic mounted as he realized that both customers were preparing to leave without making any purchases. The potential sale of a Barrett rifle represented a significant commission, and losing both customers due to his staff's behavior would be a financial disaster. "Wait, please," he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "Ma'am, sir, I think we can work something out here. Let me make you both an offer that you can't refuse. I'll take 20% off the price of any rifle you're interested in. Plus, I'll throw in a premium scope mounting service at no charge." Sarah paused, considering the offer. It was actually quite generous. 20% off a Barrett rifle would save her nearly $3,000. However, she found herself questioning whether she wanted to accept financial compensation for the disrespect she had endured. General Hayes watched her internal struggle with obvious interest. "It's your decision, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Though I would suggest that your response sends a message about acceptable standards of professional behavior." His comment crystallized Sarah's thinking. This wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about setting expectations for how other women would be treated when they entered this establishment in the future. If she accepted the discount and completed the purchase, it would essentially communicate that discriminatory treatment could be compensated for with financial incentives. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said to Jake, her voice polite but firm. "However, I've decided to take my business elsewhere. Your staff's initial assessment was that I was unqualified to purchase this rifle. Since nothing fundamental has changed except your knowledge of my credentials, I have to assume that your original judgment stands." Tommy stepped forward urgently. "That's not true. We were wrong, okay? We admit it. You're obviously qualified, more than qualified. Please don't let our mistake cost you the rifle you want." Sarah looked at him steadily. "The rifle I want is available from multiple dealers. What I can't get elsewhere is confidence that your staff will treat future female customers with appropriate respect. Your behavior today suggests that women who don't have military credentials or the endorsement of a general officer will continue to face the same dismissive treatment I experienced." Marcus's face reddened with frustration and embarrassment. "Look, we learned our lesson, okay? This won't happen again. We'll treat everyone with respect, regardless of their background." General Hayes spoke before Sarah could respond, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a professional evaluation. "Gentlemen, the problem with that assurance is that your behavior today wasn't an aberration, it was a pattern. You consistently dismissed evidence of expertise because it didn't match your preconceptions. That kind of systematic bias doesn't change because of a single embarrassing incident." Jake looked desperately between Sarah and the general, clearly grasping for any argument that might salvage the situation. "Sir, with respect, everyone has unconscious biases. What matters is that we're willing to acknowledge them and change our behavior going forward." "True," General Hayes agreed. "But acknowledgement without consequences is meaningless. Your staff dismissed a highly qualified customer based on prejudice, and only changed their behavior when confronted with irrefutable evidence of their error. That suggests a fundamental problem with your operational procedures and staff training." Sarah found herself impressed once again by the general's analytical approach. He was treating the situation like a military after-action review, identifying systemic problems rather than just addressing surface symptoms. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, an elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran baseball cap who appeared to be browsing for hunting rifles. The new customer's presence created an immediate test of the lessons the staff claimed to have learned. Sarah and General Hayes watched with interest as Jake approached the new customer with obvious deference and respect, immediately offering assistance and asking detailed questions about the customer's needs and experience. The contrast with Sarah's initial treatment was stark and unmistakable. "Gentlemen," General Hayes said quietly, "I think you've just demonstrated that your bias wasn't unconscious at all. You automatically treated another male customer with the respect and attention that you denied Sergeant Martinez, despite having no knowledge of his qualifications or background." The three staff members looked stricken as they realized what had just happened. Their immediate respectful treatment of the male customer had completely undermined their claims about learning from their mistakes with Sarah. Tommy opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find a response that didn't make the situation worse. Finally, he just said, "We messed up. Bad. We know that now." Sarah looked at the Barrett rifle one more time, feeling a genuine pang of regret. It was exactly what she wanted, and the 20% discount would have made it an excellent financial value. However, her principles were more important than saving money. "I wish you well in your business," she said to Jake politely. "I hope that future customers have better experiences than I did today." As Sarah and General Hayes prepared to leave, Marcus made one final desperate attempt to change her mind. "Ma'am, what if we donate $1,000 to a veterans charity in your name? Would that make a difference?" Sarah paused at the door, considering the offer. It was actually a thoughtful gesture that would benefit other veterans, and she appreciated the acknowledgement that their behavior had been serious enough to warrant meaningful compensation. However, she realized that accepting the offer would still send the wrong message. It would suggest that discriminatory treatment could be resolved through charitable gestures rather than fundamental changes in behavior. "I appreciate the gesture," she said finally. "But the real test of your commitment to change will be how you treat the next woman who walks through that door asking about firearms. If she's treated with the same respect you automatically show to male customers, then you'll have demonstrated real progress." General Hayes nodded approvingly at her response. "Excellent point, Sergeant. Sustainable change requires modification of standard operating procedures, not just damage control after problems are identified." As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was frustrated by the treatment she had received, but also grateful for General Hayes' intervention and support. The encounter had been educational in ways she hadn't expected, providing insights into both civilian attitudes toward veterans and the persistent challenges faced by women in male-dominated environments. General Hayes seemed to sense her reflective mood. "Sergeant, I hope you don't let today's experience discourage you from pursuing your interest in competitive precision shooting. The community needs more participants with your level of skill and experience." "Thank you, sir. I don't intend to let this stop me. If anything, it's reinforced my determination to stay involved in precision shooting." Sarah paused, then added, "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about your own interest in Barrett rifles. Are you getting back into competitive shooting?" General Hayes smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Actually, I've been considering it for some time. My wife has been encouraging me to find activities that will keep me engaged in retirement. When she heard about my interest in precision shooting, she suggested I stop talking about it and actually do something productive." Sarah laughed, appreciating the human side of the intimidating military leader. "Smart woman. Military spouses usually are." "Indeed they are," he agreed. She also pointed out that my technical knowledge is getting rusty if I don't apply it regularly. Nothing like actual shooting to keep theoretical knowledge grounded in practical reality. As they reached their vehicles, Sarah realized that the day's events had led to an unexpected opportunity. "Sir, I mentioned earlier that I have access to a private range outside Austin. If you're serious about getting back into competitive shooting, you'd be welcome to join us for some informal competitions. We're always looking for experienced shooters to raise the level of competition." General Hayes looked genuinely interested. "That's a generous offer, Sergeant. I'd very much like to take you up on it. Though I should warn you that my shooting skills may not be quite as sharp as they once were." Sarah grinned. "I doubt that, sir. But even if they are, we'll get you back up to speed quickly. The fundamentals never really go away. They just need refreshing occasionally." As they exchanged contact information, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. She had come to the gun shop expecting a straightforward commercial transaction and instead had encountered prejudice, vindication, and the unexpected reunion with a commanding officer whose respect she had earned through competence rather than connections. More importantly, the experience had reinforced her understanding of the challenges that women continued to face in environments where their capabilities were automatically questioned based on gender rather than evaluated based on evidence. The fact that it had taken the intervention of a 3-star general to get the gun shop staff to treat her with basic respect was both gratifying and deeply troubling. "Sir," she said as they prepared to part ways, "thank you for your intervention today. I know I didn't technically need the assistance, but having your support made the situation much more manageable." General Hayes looked at her seriously. "Sergeant, you handled that situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint. Most people would have lost their temper long before you showed any sign of frustration. Your response was a credit to your training and character." "I learned from good leaders," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Including you, sir." As General Hayes drove away, Sarah stood beside her pickup truck for a moment, processing the events of the day. She still needed to find a Barrett rifle, but now she had something potentially more valuable, a connection to the competitive precision shooting community through one of the most respected military leaders she had ever encountered. The gun shop episode had been frustrating and educational, but it had also led to an unexpected opportunity that might prove more valuable than any single rifle purchase. Sometimes, she reflected, the most difficult experiences led to the most rewarding outcomes. 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing on the firing line at a precision shooting competition outside Dallas, adjusting the scope on the Barrett M82A1 she had eventually purchased from a dealer in Houston. The rifle performed flawlessly, and her scores consistently placed her among the top competitors in the women's division. More satisfying than her competitive success, however, was the transformation in her relationship with the precision shooting community. General Hayes had been true to his word about facilitating her integration into competitive circles, and his endorsement had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The community welcomed her not as a curiosity or an exception, but as a fellow professional whose skills had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. Her military experience was respected and valued, and her gender was simply one characteristic among many rather than a barrier to acceptance. As for Murphy's gun shop, Sarah occasionally heard reports about their business from other members of the shooting community. Word of her experience had spread through local veteran networks, and several other female veterans had reported similar treatment when visiting the establishment. The promised changes in staff behavior had apparently been temporary at best. However, Sarah also learned that her decision to walk away from the purchase had not gone unnoticed. Several competitive shooters mentioned that they had taken their business elsewhere after hearing about the incident, and the shop's reputation within the precision shooting community had suffered accordingly. The lesson, Sarah realized, was one that applied far beyond gun shops or military service. Respect had to be earned through behavior and maintained through consistency. Temporary adjustments in response to embarrassment or social pressure were meaningless without fundamental changes in attitude and approach. Standing on the firing line, preparing for her next shot at a target 1,200 meters away, Sarah reflected on the distance she had traveled since that frustrating day at Murphy's gun shop. The journey had been challenging, but it had led to exactly where she belonged, among people who valued competence over preconceptions and who measured worth through performance rather than appearance. The shot broke cleanly, and Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet found its mark with the precision that had made her one of the Army's most effective marksmen. Some things, she thought with satisfaction, never changed. Excellence was still excellence, regardless of who achieved it or where it was demonstrated. The respect she had earned through 8 years of military service remained valid, and no amount of civilian prejudice could diminish the skills she had developed or the contributions she had made. The gun shop employees had underestimated her at their own cost, but their mistake had ultimately led to opportunities and connections that might never have developed otherwise. As she prepared for the next shot in the competition, Sarah smiled slightly, remembering General Hayes's words about the importance of maintaining standards and expectations. Today, As always, she would meet those standards through performance rather than arguments, proving once again that competence spoke louder than preconceptions. The rifle settled naturally into her shoulder, the familiar weight and balance as comfortable as an old friend. Through her scope, the distant target awaited, just as countless targets had awaited throughout her military career. This time, however, she was shooting not for mission success or unit survival, but for the pure satisfaction of precision achieved through skill, training, and determination. The shot broke perfectly, and another target fell to the expertise that no amount of prejudice could diminish or deny.